On September 13, 1987, two scrap metal collectors opened an abandoned radiotherapy machine in Goiânia. Inside were 93 grams of cesium-137 chloride. It was blue, shimmering, and it looked beautiful. No one knew that each gram emitted 3.7 x 1010 disintegrations per second. Within 4 weeks, 4 people were dead. Within 40 years, 249 people had been contaminated. J. Robert Oppenheimer died in 1967, 20 years before the accident. But here, in this chamber outside the linear sequence of time, he receives data he never calculated. And the man sitting across from him carries in his very bones proof that the equations worked, in a way Oppenheimer never signed off on. The loop this encounter opens is this. The physics that unleashed nuclear energy did not predict Goiânia, but it created precisely the conditions that made Goiânia possible. Who is responsible for what an equation allows and for what it does not prohibit? The chamber has no windows. It has walls built of silence and variable atmospheric pressure, as if the air here knows it belongs to no specific year. The table is long, of dark wood, and the light comes from a source neither of them could locate. At one end, Oppenheimer, 63 years old, advanced throat cancer, 1967, 10 weeks before his death. The cigarette is lit, but he is not smoking. He holds it between his fingers like someone carrying material proof of something they cannot name. Dark suit, the gaze of someone who calculated the end of the world and spent the rest of his life trying to process what that means. At the other end, Ari Ferreira, 34 years old, Goiânia, September 1987. He was one of the first residents of the Aeroporto neighborhood to touch the blue powder that the Deveyer family had distributed in the surrounding area. He did not die, but his body records, even today in 2030, the effects of exposure to 7 SFI of ionizing radiation, a dose that the International Commission on Radiological Protection classifies as lethal for 50% of individuals exposed without immediate treatment. The chamber operates outside linear time. Here, the half-life of Cesium-137, 30 hours 17 years, runs at different speeds at the two ends of the table. On Oppenheimer's side, the atom has not yet decayed. On Ari's side, it has already decayed 3 times. The same element,
we need to get this equipment
number,
inside.
The same Zephy-5, separated by
Move
all
the stretcher closer to the
between
entrance.
1945 and 1987. Between them, on the table, there is a stainless steel capsule. It is identical to the original casing of the Cesium F3000 teletherapy device, manufactured by the French company CGR, which was abandoned at the Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia in 1985 after a judicial bankruptcy. No one signed the removal responsibility. The capsule is closed, but both of them know what is inside. In July 1945, Oppenheimer directed the Los Alamos National Laboratory with a cumulative budget of $2 billion, equivalent to more than $30 billion in 2024, and led a team of 130,000 people distributed across 3 secret sites. The Manhattan Project was not a scientific experiment. It was a state infrastructure. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 or 45 a.m., the Trinity device detonated in the New Mexico desert with a yield of 21 kilotons of TNT. Oppenheimer watched from the bunker 9 kilometers from the detonation. Upon seeing the fireball, he quoted the Bhagavad Gita, but not from random memory. He taught himself Sanskrit at the University of Berkeley in the 1930s and had read the original text. The translation he made on the spot. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," was his own, not a translator's. That distinction matters. It was not a second-hand quotation. It was a personal interpretation by someone who understood the semantic weight of each word. Oppenheimer was not only a physicist. Before specializing in theoretical physics at Göttingen, he studied chemistry at Harvard, graduating in 3 years instead of the conventional 4. His doctoral dissertation, supervised by Max Born in 1927, dealt with quantum effects in molecules, the same field that 20 years later would underpin the calculations for the dispersal of radioactive material in urban environments. He never made this connection publicly. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where 110,000 to 210,000 people died between August and December 1945, Oppenheimer went to President Truman and said, "According to records of the meeting, I feel that I have blood on my hands." Truman replied that the responsibility was his, not Oppenheimer's, and later told his aides that he did not want to see that crybaby physicist again. In 1953, the American government revoked Oppenheimer's security clearance under accusations of communist sympathies. he was never rehabilitated in his lifetime. The formal rehabilitation process occurred only in December 2022, when the Department of Energy annulled the revocation. The Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia operated at number 57 on Rua 57 in Goiânia. In 1985, following a judicial dispute between partners, the institute was deactivated, but the radiotherapy equipment was not removed. The CESAPAN F3000 device used a capsule of cesium-137 chloride as a radiation source for tumor treatment. The source activity at the time of the accident was 50.9 TeV, that is 50.9 x 1012 disintegrations per second. For comparison, the acute lethal radiation dose for humans begins at around 4 to 5 SV in a single whole-body dose. Cesium-137, 137Cs, is a radioactive isotope with atomic numbers of 55, produced as a fission byproduct of uranium-235 and plutonium-238. Beta fission WHO to barium-137 Mech, which in turn emits gamma rays of 662 keV with a half-life of 2.5 minutes. It is the 662 keV gamma emission that penetrates tissues, ionizes DNA, and interrupts cell replication. Cesium chloride, CSCl, is water-soluble, which means that once dispersed, it contaminates soil, groundwater, and organic tissue irreversibly without specialized intervention. On September 13, 1987, Roberto and Wagner entered the abandoned building and removed the device. 2 days later, De Veer, owner of a scrapyard, bought the equipment for $25. On the night of September 16th, he and family members managed to open the iridium capsule and expose the blue powder. The glow was real, the so-called radiolytic luminescence caused by the ionization of air by gamma rays.
The southern zone is showing critical saturation.
We need to reroute resources immediately, or we lose phase one.
What about the civilian corridors?
In the Western Hemisphere up to that date. 4 people died within less than a month. Roberto, Gabriel, Israel, and Leda, the latter only 6 years old. Leda's body was buried in a lead coffin after protests by residents who tried to prevent the burial out of fear of contamination. 249 people were contaminated. 7 properties were demolished. 3,500 tons of radioactive waste were removed from the city. If you have made it this far, the algorithm has not found you yet. Subscribe to the channel. Each episode exists only if you keep it alive. Oppenheimer looks at the capsule on the table. He recognizes the geometry, not this specific model, but the logic: spherical casing, threaded slot access port, radioactive material contained by steel walls of calculated thickness to attenuate radiation to safe operational levels. It is an architecture he helped conceive. Not this particular device, but the principle, Oppenheimer. The thickness of the casing was calculated to reduce the exposure rate to less than 2 nanometres per hour at 1 meter distance. That has been the IAEA standard since 1960. Did someone ignore the calculation? ARI. No. The casing functioned perfectly for years. The problem was the chain of custody. When the institute closed, the device remained. There was no federal Brazilian law requiring immediate removal. The National Nuclear Energy Commission, the CNN,
look at the density here. They must have moved
existed,
through this neighborhood first.
But no one went to retrieve it. Oppenheimer sets down the cigarette. This is a gesture recorded in interviews and photographs. When something troubled him intellectually, he would put the cigarette aside.
I know, but the mountains look beautiful.
Oppenheimer. Physics did not commit the error.
The satellite imagery confirms the movement here.
But the ground calculations
ARI.
don't align with that
With
trajectory.
respect, that
We need to
separation does not
reassess the
exist
entry
in the
point.
real world. Physics produced the material, physics described its 30-year half-life, physics calculated its tissue penetrance, but no equation included what happens when a scrapyard in Goiânia buys this for $25. The 662 keV gamma rays emitted by 137b after Sears 137 decay have a mass attenuation coefficient in human tissue of approximately 0.83c Sembodiradjurg. This means that to attenuate 50% of the radiation, a tissue layer of approximately 8.4 cm would be required. In other words, the radiation passes through the human body without being completely absorbed. The damage is internal, progressive, and cumulative, affecting primarily cells with high division rates, bone marrow, gastrointestinal epithelium, and gonads. Oppenheimer. In 1945, I told Truman I felt blood on my hands. He replied that the responsibility was the state's, not the scientists'. I disagreed with him. But the argument you are making now is the same as Truman's. and I disagreed with Truman. ARI. It is not the same argument.
You won't believe what happened at the
Truman was
meeting
saying that the
yesterday.
political decision excludes technical responsibility. I'm saying the opposite. Technical competence implies responsibility for the applications, including those you did not directly sign off on. You knew that CS-137 would be used in medicine. You knew it would be distributed in countries with deficient regulatory infrastructure. The equation that calculates the lethal dose does not change depending on where the material is. Here, the element the chamber produces. The light at Oppenheimer's end diminishes by exactly 3.7%, the equivalent of the loss of CS-137 activity at the center of the light. It is as if the space itself confirms Ari's argument of physical demonstration. The CS-137 that contaminated Goiânia was a product of nuclear fission. That is, it was created in reactors as a byproduct of energy production or plutonium for weapons. But there is a detail that rarely appears. The same decay that makes it dangerous makes it detectable. The 6062 keV gamma peak is so characteristic that scintillation spectrometers can identify CS-137 in concentrations of 1.1 BQ co-mass of soil. This means that, paradoxically, CS-137 is one of the easiest radionuclides to map and contain, if equipment and protocol exist. In 1987, Brazil had the equipment. It did not have the Radiological Emergency Protocol. The CNN only developed the National Radiological Emergency Plan after the Goiânia accident. The chamber produces a document. It appears on the table between the two of them, not as paper, but as a luminous projection directly on the dark wood surface, as if the surface had memory. It is the final IAEA report on the Goiânia accident published in 1988. Official reference, IAEA Safety Series number 70. Oppenheimer reads. He reads fast. He was known for processing technical texts at abnormal speed, a capacity documented by the students at Berkeley and Princeton. What he finds in the report is not a physics error. It is something no equation predicted. The IAEA report identified that the original capsule had been designed to withstand mechanical impact equivalent to a 9-meter fall. The scrap metal collectors used a manual drill, a tool with torque of approximately 15 to 20 MEM. The capsule design had not considered this specific attack vector, manual opening with low-cost tools available at any scrapyard in the world. The point of failure was not in the physics of the material, it was in the implicit assumption that no one would attempt to open the capsule manually. Oppenheimer. The assumption was documented in IAEA safety protocols since 1960. Each radiotherapy source should have tracking by serial number, annual inspection, and a disposal plan. The failure was not in the capsule design, it was in the tracking system. ARI. In 1985, Brazil had 76 registered radiotherapy sources. Of those, the CNN knew the location of 74. The other two were in institutes that had ceased operations. The Goiânia device was one of the two. The tracking system existed. It simply did not include what happens when the tracked item disappears from the map. Oppenheimer looks at the capsule on the table. For the first time in this encounter, he has no immediate reply. This is also documented. According to Hans Betty, his colleague at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer was capable of genuine intellectual silence. A silence distinct from hesitation, because it was the silence of someone recalculating. Oppenheimer. In 1945, we calculated the explosion. We calculated the immediate radiation. We calculated the radioactive rain. What we did not calculate was what happens with the material in the 50 years that follow. When it disperses into hospitals...
The filter applied correctly, but the result counter is showing a discrepancy in the total record count. I'm cross-referencing the logs now.
Because it was not within the scope of the question. ARO. Who defines the scope of the question defines the scope of the responsibility. If this argument made you stop, the like is the signal that tells the algorithm this kind of content should exist. It is mechanical, but it is what we have. The pattern this encounter reveals is not about guilt, it is about the structural interval between technical competence and the prediction of second and third order consequences. Oppenheimer created the bomb. The bomb did not create Goiânia directly, but the nuclear physics infrastructure that the bomb accelerated, reactors, isotopes, nuclear medicine, radiotherapy sources, distributed radioactive material across a planet with asymmetric regulation. The CS-137 that entered Ari's body existed because nuclear fission was real and useful, not because someone planned to contaminate Goiânia. According to the IAEA 2023 database, there are today more than 11,000 catalogued orphaned radioactive sources worldwide. sources that have lost custody tracking. Cesium-137 is the most common radionuclide in this category. Approximately 40% of the sources
Equipe, atenção. Próximo barril, nível de radiação estável.
Confirmado, supervisor. Carregando.
It was a documented case of a systemic pattern that continued. Oppenheimer recalculated this encounter. What his silence confirmed is that the responsibility equation of a scientist does not end on the last line of the paper.
Próximo. Venha por aqui, por favor.
Doutor, quando teremos os resultados?
Mantenham a calma, estamos fazendo o possível.
In 1947, we helped found the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We set the doomsday clock at 7 minutes to midnight, not because we thought the end was imminent, but because public attention needs a reading instrument to understand what it cannot see. You are telling me the instrument failed. ARI. I am saying the instrument measured the risk of nuclear war. It did not.
These coordinates are obsolete. We must adhere to the original plan.
The situation on the ground has changed, Colonel. You cannot ignore these new reports.
And completely different scales of consequence. The chamber at this moment produces the final datum. The light at Oppenheimer's end reaches exactly 662 Romulan, the wavelength equivalent to 662 keV on a visible scale. It is the gamma signature of CS-137 translated into the human visual range. Orange-red, almost beautiful. Like the blue powder the De Vere family distributed in September 1987. Oppenheimer looks at the light. He says nothing. The pattern extracted from this silence is verifiable in history. In his last public interview in 1965, he said that the only thing he regretted was not having been able to anticipate what was not in the original question. That sentence is not fictional, it is on record. The chamber closes, the capsule on the table remains. Neither of them touched it. In October 1987, the Kennen removed 3,500 tons of radioactive waste from Goiânia and deposited them in a temporary storage area in Abadia de Goiás, where they remain to this day in permanent containment because Cesium-137 with a 30-year half-life will still have measurable activity in 2077. Lady,
Welcome to Vienna, Ambassador. The session begins at 10.
Thank you. We are looking forward to the discussions on the new safeguards agreement.
She would not go alone. The lead coffin weighed more than 500 kilograms. The cemetery residents tried to prevent the burial. The city hall needed a police escort. In the next episode, the number no one publicly revealed about Goiânia is not the dose absorbed by the victims. It is the number of people who were exposed and never knew, because the Kennen's notification criteria in 1987 excluded contamination below a specific threshold. That threshold, and who defined it, is the subject of the next chamber.